Hello everyone, welcome to Electricity Canada's Conversation Series. Electricity Canada is the national voice for sustainable electricity for its members and the customers they serve. My name is Farhan Mirza and I'm pleased to be your host for today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am broadcasting from today is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'd also like to recognize Canada as the lands of the First Peoples, Inuit, and Métis. I would like to pay homage to the Indigenous peoples past, present, and future that continue to work, educate, and contribute to the strength of our country. I would like to recognize that this land is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and one that continues to be unceded territory. The Conversation Series features presentations from Electricity Canada's corporate partners, and the series will highlight a variety of Canadian and international solutions to current and future challenges faced by the industry. Working with our partners, these webinars have been developed to be of specific interest to those working in the electric utility space from generation through to the customer. For a list of our upcoming sessions, please check out our website at electricity.ca. Just before we get going, a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to go over. Our session today is scheduled to run from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Questions can be asked, and we'd encourage you to do so as they come to mind by typing them into the questions function on your screen, and I will ask them to our panel at the end of the session. They'll be asked at the end of the presentation. Following the session, we'll also send out a brief survey to our webinar attendees. We'd love to hear your candid feedback if you'd like to share any topics that you'd like to have included in the conversation series in the future. Lastly, please keep an eye out for our future webinars through our monthly newsletter, Current Affairs. With over 6,000 subscribers, Current Affairs is the place to go for Canadian industry news as we connect the national value chain from generation to the customer. If you'd like to receive current affairs, you can subscribe to this free publication on our website at electricity.ca. Today on the Conversation Series, I'd like to welcome Burns and McDonnell in 1898. We're going to ask us the question, is the grid ready? Electric vehicles, solar, storage, buildings, electrification, new consumer goods are all coming to your grid. If policy holds, the only energy path to a premise is via the grid is by 2050. Winter outages will be unacceptable. So will outages on hot summer days. Planning engineers don't have time to look at the grid holistically. New infrastructure cannot be built with sufficient speed to meet the current demand, and no one's going to have a perfect crystal ball. There is, however, a shortcut to looking at the grid model to scenarios and create no regret strategies focusing engineering time on the most likely areas that need your support. This webinar will look at the near term of energy demand, the growth of renewables, and the impacts to organizational processes while discussing potential advances that can help mitigate the stress points. Our presenters today from Burns & Mac in 1898 are Doug Hausman, Principal Consultant, Eric Matchett, Senior Management Consultant, and Joanna Osawe, Senior Business Development Manager. Welcome to the Conversation Series. Joanna, we'd like to turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much. Before we get electrified with this amazing discussion that we have ahead, we definitely want to start this off with a safety moment. As we know, we're about to get into some winter driving, and quite frankly, we certainly need to be very cautious of slowing down. Be very cautious of 1 second here. My apologies. Oops. Yeah, slowing down because again, we're in Canada up north, so we understand all the consequences that make driving dangerous. Please make sure that you do change your tires into winter tires because again, the traction needs to be of good movement. We need to be really sharp and really wary of the icy surfaces that are about to bestow us. Make sure you top up your windshield fluid because again, we need to ensure that not only our replacement of our wiper blades, but also our windshield fluid is topped up. Make sure that you also keep the gas tank topped up because again, think caution. Plan ahead and make sure you have enough fuel. See and be seen. This is extremely important. We need to make sure that we clear all the snow from the hood, roof, and windows. I note that most of us on this call discussion, we've seen those folks that are driving with so much snow that they cannot see, and those are the hazardous drivers that we need to make sure that we're not. Get an emergency car kit. That is extremely important because if we do get stuck in snow or in an inappropriate situation, our emergency car kit will be able to help us. Also, make sure to keep a blanket, a flashlight. That all goes with the emergency car kit. So, who am I? I'm Joanna Osawe. I'm the Senior Business Development Manager at Burns & McDonnell. I'm also the President and CEO of WIRE, Women in Renewable Energy, and I've been appointed to Minister Stephen Guilbeault's Federal Advisory Council for Canada. I will pass it over to Eric Matchett to introduce himself.
Hi everyone, really excited to be here with you for this webinar. Eric Matchett, I'm the Senior Management Consultant with 1898 & Co. at Division of Burns & McDonnell. And post in my career, I've been 20 years roughly in the utility space, primarily focused on continuous improvement and change management. Really happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Eric. Mr. Doug Hausman.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm really pleased to be here. I have enjoyed working for the last 40 years with Canadian utilities and learning some of the things that are specific to Canada. And I'm looking forward to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Doug and Eric. And we're about to get electrified right now. So, who are we? Well, we're Burns & McDonnell and also 1898 Co. We have been around for 125 years, since 1898. We are 100% employee owned. We have over 13,000 professionals working in-house and throughout globally. We have 90% repeat business and over 8 billion annual sales. Why are we number one? Well, we're number one in power. We're certainly number two in aerospace, 3 in chemical plants, 4 in government offices, number 5 in petroleum, 6 in the top 100 design build firms, number 7 top 500 design firms, top 20 firms in combined design CM and PM professional services revenue, and number 20 in construction management, and number 31 in top 400 contractors. I am so proud and thrilled to be part of Burns & McDonnell and also working with 1898. We have a lot of great global practices at Burns & McDonnell and 1898. And of course, 1898 and Co., aviation and federal, construction, energy, environmental services, global facilities, oil, gas, and chemicals, transmission and distribution, transportation, and water. So you may wonder where we're at. Well, we're all over, and this map will continue to grow blue. I'm very proud to be sitting here downtown Toronto, where I'm located right now. But as you can see, we're all throughout North America. We continue to grow our UK presence, our MENA regions, India, and Manila. And next year for 2024, I'm sure you'll see a different map as we continue to grow and ensure that we provide the solutions to solve your obstacles. I'm very pleased to announce as well that our incoming President and CEO, Leslie Duke, will be in 2024. Very excited to welcome our new President and CEO and thank Ray Kovalik, our soon-to-be ex-President and CEO who has served with Burns & McDonnell. So 79 years, that's a long time being in Canada, right? So 2024 will mark 80 years, which I'm sure we will be celebrating as Canadians. We have over 3.8 billion EPC projects, 6,000 megawatts of generation projects, 3,200 kilometers of linear infrastructure, 1 billion of program managed, 20 million Indigenous businesses. We are very, very near and dear to Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, and we certainly want to continue the engagement with Indigenous communities because that is near and dear to our heart. So, that being said, I'm going to put a pause and stop my video and hand this over to Mr. Doug Hausman.
Thank you, Joanna. We are facing a large number of challenges over the next few years as we transition the grid. None larger than figuring out how to deal with electrifying transportation. Projections show that the electricity use globally will grow between 40 and 50% total when we electrify transportation. Canada being one of the top 3 countries in vehicles per capita will feel that transition. When I look at Calgary, for instance, with their 13.2 kV circuits and an average of more than 1,000 customers on many of those circuits, you start to realize that you're looking at a circuit that has a 9 MVA or a 10 MVA rating at 600 amps. And all of a sudden you're looking at, okay, what if I electrify 1 vehicle per household with 1,000 customers on that circuit? Well, if we use a standard level 2 charger, which has an input of 8 kV or 8 kW, you're looking at adding to that circuit another 8 megawatts if all of those chargers are on at one time, which means you have 1 or 2 megawatts of available electricity for all other purposes. Now, given the typical amount of driving that people do, they need between an hour and 2 for charging. Current charging statistics from areas with high electric vehicles show that most customers come home between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening. They immediately plug their vehicle in to charge, and they let it charge overnight. In many cases, overcharging for what they actually need the next day. The typical peak on those circuits in places like the Sacramento Municipal Utility District show that as many as 84% of the electric vehicles are on at the same time charging. So we're going to have to find a way to diversify that charging. Hopefully we can get it down to 20% at a time, because 2 hours should be enough for the average vehicle to gain enough new charge for the next day to be able to do what most people want. Now that changes when we start looking at a Thursday night, because if you're going away for the weekend, you'd like to have a fully charged vehicle. You don't want to just put enough in to get to work and back again the next day. You'll see the same thing on Sunday nights as people come back from a weekend at the cottage or wherever they've gone to have fun over the weekend. And so we're going to have to figure out not only how to strengthen the grid, but also how to moderate and diversify when people are charging. The typical 5 kV circuit has a struggle to operate when 10% of the vehicles on that circuit are electric, regardless of the diversification, because many of those circuits are already at 80 or 90% loaded. And so we're going to have to start thinking about, do we continue to maintain low voltage circuits in the 5, 10, and even 15 kV range, or are we going to have to look at something different? And then, of course, when we start looking at public charging stations, you're looking at 4 to 20 150 kW chargers for light vehicles for fast charging. Even 15 kV circuits have trouble supporting that with their current load. And then if we start looking at heavy vehicles, and luckily they're going to electrify at a lower speed from the standpoint of grid infrastructure. But Tesla originally announced a 750 kV charger. The mega charger now have announced and started installing a 1 megawatt charger for semi trucks. And you look at a depot like Pepsi has in California, where they started with 21 Tesla semis and they will soon have 50. if those vehicles are all charging at the same time on the Mega Charger 2s, that Pepsi depot goes from a 1 megawatt load to a 50 megawatt load. And truck stops get to be very, very interesting because you're looking at loads there in excess of 30 megawatts. And in some cases, for some of the very large truck stops, 150 to 200 megawatts. Joanna, if I can have the next slide. So solar is also interesting, and it's especially interesting in Canada. You know, if we look at the overall load in Canada, or the overall generation in Canada, we see a much lower level of winter generation than we do in the summertime. So if we look at Quebec, for instance, in December, a kilowatt of solar will produce about 50 kWh of energy during the whole month of December. But if we go back and look at it in July, it produces about 3 times that amount of electricity. For some reason, Canada seems to be situated far enough away from the equator that you actually really notice the seasons with solar output during that time period. And it's important to understand that as we get to more electric transportation, we need more power in those vehicles during the winter time because the current heating systems for the cabins in those electric vehicles can consume up to 30% of the electricity that's used just for a light vehicle. And for a bus, it can be up to 80% of the electricity in the batteries that are consumed for heating, which is why many buses can use compressed natural gas or other facilities to heat the cabin of the vehicle rather than continuing to run on electricity. Now, solar is a good thing. Putting it on the roof can be very helpful. Storing it at the individual household or premise is even more useful because then it can be used to charge those vehicles in the future and not end up making a trip out on the electric grid, only to have to come back to the electric grid at some point later. And where it goes between the time it leaves and when it comes back is interesting. I've had many advocates tell me that, oh, it just runs around on the grid until we need it. It's not a problem. We don't need any storage. And for anybody who understands Ohm's law, you know that that particular bit of information is a misconception. We're going to end up putting an awful lot of solar in. The question is, do we put solar in to support all of the seasons, or do we put it in to support the spring and summer, or do we put it in to support the fall season? When we looked at this with Hydro Ottawa against typical household use patterns, we ended up seeing that we needed 10 times the amount of solar in Ottawa in the wintertime that we needed in the summertime to be able to support the load. And if you haven't done those kinds of calculations, I would suggest that you want to do it. May I have the next slide, Joanna? So storage is useful. I just came from the US Department of Energy peer review for storage. I've been there all week. There are some interesting changes and some interesting new storage ideas. One of the most interesting is a 90% efficient sodium storage battery that holds 89% of the total storage for as much as 78 weeks. So that's about 4 times better than you would get with a Form energy system. The sodium is about 3 times as costly as the Form energy system, and it's probably still a decade away from being commercially available. But we're going to see an awful lot of energy storage, and it doesn't just have to be in batteries or flow batteries. Canada is blessed with a large amount of hydro resources. Many of the dams that exist could be retrofit to do pump storage. Closed loop hydro like Ludington in Michigan is a good idea in many places in Canada, even along the shore of the Great Lakes in many places, as Michigan has done with Ludington. And I'm not advocating that Michigan has anything special other than 50 years ago, they put that facility together and it's been running with very little issue over the last 50 years. May I have the next slide, Joanna? So here's something to think about. Today we have natural gas, we have propane, we have wood, we have petroleum, we have a lot of other sources of energy that we use. If you look at what the climate advocates are focusing on, they don't want propane. They don't want natural gas. They don't want coal. They don't want wood. They don't want anything but electricity, and they don't want any electricity that's made with any generation other than non-emission generation. They're slowly coming around to the idea that maybe nuclear needs to be part of the overall solution, and Canada's recent announcements on nuclear power, I think, bodes well for Canada. I think they're at least a decade ahead of the US in terms of policy decisions, which I think is a wonderful idea. But how long an outage could you sustain on a cold winter day, maybe minus 20? Could you go 4 hours? Could you go 8? Could you go 24? Could you go 48? How about 122 hours, which is what some of the premises in Texas dealt with during Winter Storm Uri? At minus 20 degrees, there are an awful lot of people who might be vulnerable to not having heat. And if the only way to get heat is through electricity, that's going to be interesting to everybody involved. Next slide, please, Joanna. So one of the things that's going on, and in many ways it's a good thing, is the electrification of heating and cooling in buildings. Heat pumps take less energy during the summer, bringing the peak down. A good idea is a utility in Baltimore, Maryland, where their current summer peak is about 10 gigawatts and their current winter peak is about 6 gigawatts. And if we move to 100% heat pumps in their service territory, that summer peak drops down to only 8 gigawatts. Unfortunately, because they're heavily natural gas right now, their winter peak just for heating rises from 6 to 11. And if we add electric vehicles on top of that, winter night peak runs about 17 gigawatts, to give you an idea of what the change is going to be in the infrastructure. Next slide, please, Joanna. So we don't know how fast we're going to get to 100% non-emission transportation. We don't know how fast rooftop and utility scale solar is going to happen. We don't know how fast buildings are going to transition to electric heating. We don't know how much will be heat pumps and how much will be something else. We don't know how fast gas will go away or other non-electric heat. And we don't know how fast storage is going to happen. And we also don't know how fast new housing is going to come into the area as the population grows from migration and other sources. Now, if I were to do traditional what-if analysis using traditional load flow tools, I might be a week or two with a planner on each substation and associated circuits. And I don't know where to start. I have a good idea of what my current issues are. I could start there. but is that really where my population is? So one of the ways to do this is a bottom-up analysis, circuit by circuit, looking at what happens if you put 10% EVs plus 5% solar plus 10% heat pumps on the grid, or if I go to 100% EVs in a particular area on my grid with very little solar. And the giggle is Sacramento Municipal Utility District has found that most households can either afford an electric vehicle or solar, but not both. So the EVs and the solars solar is not in the same location, which means if I want to charge some of those vehicles that are home during the day, that solar's still got to move onto the grid and move to the home that's got that EV. So this analysis has been done on 39,000 distribution circuits in North America and just over 6,000 substations. Some of the results are non-intuitive to the people who are used to looking at their own grid, but when they go through and hand over hand look at the circuits, they see why it is and what's going to happen. And this really allows people to plan and organize no regret strategies. So if you think in 2030, 20% of the vehicles will be EVs, if you think 10% of the homes will have solar on the roof, if you think 20% of the homes will have heat pump or other electrified heating systems that don't today, that gives you one scenario. You can look at other scenarios which have different numbers and look at the rank of the individual distribution circuits as you run through this what if analysis and find out which substations and which circuits rise to the top and need further analysis and potentially proactive work to get them ready for what's coming. And that's very important to do because most of us don't build 6 to 10 new substations every year. Most of us don't build 100 kilometers or more of new overhead distribution a year. And many of us don't work to get 50 or 60 kilometers of new rights of way in order to run a new circuit and not end up double circuiting on overhead poles. Next slide, please. And I'll turn this over to Eric and let Eric talk about a little bit of the changing landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And so, Doug has done a great job here of describing to us, the challenges and the opportunities before us in the utility space. And certainly this audience appreciates better than anybody the demands of the sector and the race to decarbonize and electrify. These two goals are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but at times, we appreciate that they seem next to impossible to achieve. By way of interesting stats, last week, I believe it was, the International Energy Agency recently stated that in their report that globally, we will need to add or replace 2 to 5 times the transmission infrastructure by 2040, in order to meet our climate goals. And if you think to pile on to that, Bloomberg also talked about, the investment and the cost required over the coming decades. And they estimated our spend on grid modernization and build outs is going to go from about 274 billion to over 1 trillion by 2050. So without question, we are seeing unprecedented impacts in the utility space, on people, on process, and technology. And when we consider the scale and the magnitude of disruption, it's no wonder utilities, and more specifically, the employees within the utilities, are the #1 sector impacted by change. And what makes the situation more challenging is that our people are already feeling the strain. So fewer resources coupled with employee turnover and the avalanche of retirements from our most knowledgeable employees, they create very challenging dynamics. So I think we need to, appreciate and acknowledge the challenge before us by engaging in a truly thoughtful conversation. Right? Next slide, please. Speed will ultimately become the single greatest contributor here to our success, enabled by regulatory reform, of course, but how quickly can we design, build, and construct the infrastructure needed to meet the demand of the future? With the need for speed at hand, we need to carefully consider a roadmap forward, addressing the impacts of people, process, and technology. And so that really starts today with a deep appreciation of where we are currently. And then realistically, what is our vision for what we want to achieve and ultimately become? What will we see as an effort, as an effect of our direct result? And most importantly, what are we going to do to get there in the time that we have? And so when we consider the technical insight that Doug has described, we can begin to build a balanced roadmap that considers your unique challenges and opportunities with the practicality that aligns your people, your processes, and your enabling technology that makes sense. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna. You're on mute, Joanna.
I certainly apologize about that. Okay, so before we get into Q&As, I do want to ask Eric and Doug, and specifically Doug, if you leave here with nothing else here, what is your big takeaway?
I think the big takeaway is you got to stay in front of this 8-ball. If you get behind the 8-ball at any point, finding the resources to be able to do the amount of construction to catch up is going to be almost impossible. In the studies that I've done, it's between $10,000 and $25,000 per customer to do the upgrades to the distribution grid. I'm not going to count transmission or generation here, just distribution substations and distribution. And trying to gather the capital for that work, finding enough skilled resources, and getting ahead of the lead times on transformers and other equipment is difficult. If you're proactive, you're going to have a chance. If you're reactive, the 8-ball is probably going to be on top of you in a very short period of time.
Thank you so much. So for everyone, loud and clear, be proactive. Before we really jump into the Q&A session, I certainly want to ask a few questions to our amazing subject matter experts. And one of the things that I definitely want to talk about is, Doug, you're talking about regional and geographic considerations that are critical to grid reliability. How does seasonality and geography play into grid modernization strategies?
Well, if you look at the Sahara, obviously, down on the equator, you don't have to deal with seasonality. When you start dealing with Saskatoon and places of that sort, you very quickly begin to understand what the seasonality is and what's available. And of course, one thing you never have to worry about in the Sahara is icing over of solar or wind turbines. Whereas in Canada, there are points in time when the wind turbines can actually be loads in order to keep the fluids warm enough for the turbine to be able to turn when the wind blows. And obviously, in many mornings, if you have a heavy overnight fog, that fog can freeze to the actual PV, which gives you less than you would expect in that particular season. So those are issues that you got to think about. While PV watts will show you a reasonable idea of what your production will be, local weather will tell you how much of the time, even though you got reasonable irradiation, irradiation, that you got 6 inches or half a meter of snow on top of PV panels, and you got to wait for it to slide off of those panels.
Thank you very much, Doug. Eric, you mentioned the need for speed here as utilities look to transform. Can you tell us more about the importance of process-centric cultures to this transformation effort?
Yeah, sure, Joanne. It's a great question. And when we think about all that is before us in order to meet these obligations, in order to, embark on this transformation journey and the complications that Doug has described, one thing I think we would attest is organizations that are heavily process-centric are going to be able to navigate this a little bit better than utilities that might be less reliant on, good process maturity, right, from an organizational perspective. I mean, if we think about the nuclear industry, I mean, by the nature of their existence, they are incredibly process-focused, process-centric. Some utilities, whether vertically integrated or otherwise, have varying degrees of that as a reflection. And so it's a point that, it will be an enabler for the journey going forward. And for some organizations who, again, are less prone for good process maturity practices, there might be a bit of a challenge in meeting that 8 ball that Doug referred to earlier. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Doug, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions as it relates to electricity and new technology. What do you believe is a predominant myth or misconception?
I think one of the things that I see every day are advocates saying that we can do it all with solar, we need no other generation source. Another one is that we can get away with 4 hours of storage. I'm sorry, winter nights in Canada tend to be longer than 4 hours. So if you're doing it all with solar and your storage is 4 hours, in Toronto on the 21st of December, your power runs out about 7 o'clock in the evening. Stores aren't even closed by 7 o'clock in the evening in Toronto.
We're going to get cold quick, Doug.
Yeah, well, I can't go to the disco anymore in Toronto. Yes, I am that old.
Fantastic. Well, we sure are up north. I'm very proud to be Canadians, and thank you for that insight. Eric,
we have a couple of questions from the audience, Joanna. So if you'd like, I can ask a couple of questions from members of the audience. So first one up here is for Doug. Doug, what would be the impact of off-peak rates that many Canadian utilities are adopting?
Well, it depends on when the off-peak is. We're probably going to have to shift the off-peak into the middle of the day as we get more and more solar and more vehicles charge at night. That means an interesting infrastructure conundrum for the utilities. Do they build chargers into the areas where the vehicles are during the daytime in order to take advantage of the energy that might be available for renewables, or do they build storage with those same dollars so that they can charge those cars at night? We've used a 2.5 times rate for nighttime charging in Sacramento. So we've more than doubled the price at night to try and get people to charge during the daytime. We've managed to change that charging rate at night by a little over 1%. So we've gone from 85.2% down to 84.1% of the people charging at night. It's only about $5 or so a night to charge. That's still cheaper than buying a tank of gasoline for many people.
Right. Thank you, Doug. I've got a couple more. One's a comment actually. So someone talking about the wind turbines. So they say wind turbines shut down when temperatures get below -35 centigrade, which are the temperatures we see in Canada during the winter load, when the winter load is at peak. Do you have any comments on that?
They absolutely do. The fluids get too cold, and in many cases, you've got to run heaters on the fluids to keep them at least somewhat viscous. There's work being done to find the equivalent of 0W50W motor oil for use in the transmission and in the thrust bearing. We'll see if that bears out, but at very cold temperatures, yes, the turbines tend to be more of a load than anything else. As the temperature gets really cold, you get one of two things. Either it's sitting over the top of you and making no wind, or it's an Alberta clipper, to use a very old term, and the wind is blowing too fast to make electricity. So those are conditions that you have to consider when you look at wind turbines. That's not to say wind turbines aren't useful or they don't have a lot of uses, but there's still a lot of cold weather research that needs to be done on making wind turbines useful.
For sure. Next question here is, what is the process that your organization goes through with utilities to help them get ready for the challenges ahead?
So we tend to collect data from the existing distribution circuits, including physical characteristics, the number of customers, peak load, summer, winter, and we load that all into a database. And then we've got a control panel that gives you the ability to vary about 70 characteristics that you want to look at in the future. And by being able to vary those characteristics, you can say no electric vehicles, or 100% electric vehicles, or 40% electric vehicles, or we're going to look at this in 2040 or 2035 or whatever. And by being able to vary those characteristics and use information about the built environment, the number of vehicles per household and other things like that, you can then run scenarios. And if you were to try and do that with typical planning tools like Simon, Windmill, and those sorts of tools, those scenarios might take a week of substation. In the planning tool that we built, it takes about 5 minutes. So it just, once the data is all in there, you can run through 50 or 100 permutations in a day in a workshop and start to look at what rises to the top, which circuits are always at the top for overloading, which substations, and other things of that sort. How much is the total cost to do whatever the scenario says? And you can look at, am I better off to put in more storage? Am I better off to put in storage at the substation or storage at the premise? And other things of that ilk. And so it gives you a tool that you can continue to operate and update. One of the utilities that I'm working with, we built this tool the first time in 2015. They do an annual update and bring that into planning sessions. I'm pleased to say that about 90% of the 2015 results, when we run newer results, are still the same in terms of prioritization, which means it's fairly consistent. We've increased from 2015 the base scenario, the minimum we're going to see, just because of the rate at which some of the policy is changing that utility has to deal with.
Excellent. Got a few more questions coming in, and this is for Eric or Doug, whoever would like to take this. EVs are the biggest disruptors to the grid ever since the advent of air conditioning of homes. What lessons from before can we apply to the ones we have now?
Well, I think one of the things we learned with air conditioning was it got started slow. And once it crossed the threshold price, it sped up significantly. And it happened in clusters because people would go into the air-conditioned home in their neighborhood and wouldn't want to go back to their house, so they had to get air conditioning too. We're seeing the same thing out in California and other places with EVs. You get one car in a neighborhood, and within 2 years, you got 20 to 40 cars in that neighborhood. And so you're now dealing with fast clustering, which was something we had happen in air conditioning. We decided in many cases to change the maximum load rating on circuits. Some utilities are still running at the emergency rating of what they've built for their circuits and praying that they don't break anything on a hot day from air conditioning, which means they don't have a lot of overhead on those circuits that's free and able to support EVs. Those utilities that took the time to upgrade voltage or split circuits are in a lot better shape than the utilities that didn't.
That's a great point. Next question. A lot of utilities are adopting DERMS platform in order to control beyond the meter assets. Do you think that DERM platforms and utility curtailment would be sufficient and reliable for the next few years until we build storage or generation capacity?
Oh.
No. Short and sweet.
None of the
All right.
DERMS packages today are sufficient to run the kinds of programs we want to run. You're looking at needing demand side management in the 30 to 50% at night of your current load on some circuits as EVs come in. When you start analyzing the load on those circuits on a winter night, more than half of that load is heating. Do we just plain turn the thermostats off all night?
Great question. All right, next question we have here. Do utilities need smart meters in place to allow the analysis you've just outlined?
No, but it helps.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, that's good. That's the questions we have so far. If the audience has any more questions, feel free to tap them into the questions function. We still have a few minutes. Joanna, if you'd like to come back on screen, if you have any more questions to ask of Eric or Doug, we have a couple minutes to go through them now as well.
Yeah, fantastic questions, and thank you for all the great information and intel. This question is for Eric. So, Eric, research is showing that employees in the utility sector are undergoing the most amount of change of any sector. Why is that a concern?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's I think it's obvious, right, based on the conversation we're just having, right? The scenarios that Doug is describing, the questions that were being asked. The utility space is the sector that's undergoing the most amount of change, bar none, for the reasons that we already discussed. And I think it is a concern in that if we don't manage it properly, it's the employees that are going to get us from point A to point B. And all of the technology, all of the requirements that's going to enable this transformation is dependent upon our employee base. And so we really need to get our arms around the change fatigue factor, if you will, as to what is kind of the current state with our employees. How are we managing the change to them, to the processes, to the work they're doing? And if we can do that effectively, then we can certainly enable this transformation, I think, a little bit more smooth than we would otherwise. But leaving the impact of change to its own devices is a bit of a recipe for disaster. And I think we see that, and that manifests itself through employee absenteeism or sick time or what have you. So it's important that the sector that we're talking about undergoing so much change, we really need to get our arms around the employee well-being aspect in order to navigate this path forward.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Eric. Joanna actually came up with a couple more questions from the audience while Eric was answering that one. So another question from the audience member. Any hope that the new generation nuclear can make a positive impact? Why or why not?
I think any nuclear, old generation or new generation, will make a positive impact. A couple of things I like about the newer generation: comes in different sizes, Some nuclear reactors in the small modular or micro reactor range are 5 megawatts. Those could easily go at a truck stop or charging location. They'll run for 10 to 20 years. And when you're done, the nuclear matter in those reactors is all used up. It's a great way to take nuclear waste and turn it into, oh, we can put this back in the ground without worrying about the next 10,000 years. The other thing that I really like about the new generation of reactors is many of them are controllable. They're no longer run them up to maximum operations levels and chain the throttle for the next 18 months. And in 18 months, when it's time to refuel, you bring it back down to zero, refuel over a 2-week time period, and bring it back up to maximum and chain the throttle again. Now you can vary the amount of power that the reactor makes from as little as 0% all the way up to 100% of what that reactor is capable of. And that means that they can be as reactive as a typical combined cycle natural gas plant. That solves significant problems in the need for pump storage or other things like that that the original generation of nuclear had.
Doug, if you think of as well in the Canadian context, I think there's great applicability here for SMRs in our northernmost communities, right? Our northernmost communities that in some cases are powered by diesel generators.
And having been to a couple of those with Canadian utilities to look at ways to make them run better, I think those micro reactors may be useful in those areas and may significantly reduce the amount of fuel that those communities need to import during the short winter season when they can get that fuel in, or the short summer season where they can get that fuel in, depending on how they get it in. And that means that there's a lot more room in that season to import other things to those communities and improve their lot in life. And I think that's something that a lot of people are not thinking about right now when they look at nuclear reactors and remote communities and things of that sort. I just had a conversation with an Alaskan co-op yesterday where we started talking about the 9.1 million gallons of diesel fuel they have to import every year to be able to support the communities that they operate in. And what would happen if they didn't have to bring that fuel in terms of the ability to bring in more food and more other things, and how many more people who would like to move into those communities could actually be supported by those communities.
Yeah,
that's great. Cool. So we have this and then 2 more questions that we've got from the audience. So let's see if we can squeeze those in. So the next question is, are jurisdictions with higher EV penetration transitioning to winter peaking due to the electricity consumption due to cabin heating?
EVs are going to be 4 times the impact of heating in communities that are currently 50% or more natural gas for heating. And communities with high penetration are already starting to see winter night as their peak time period. And if you project that out based on the number of customers, their winter peak by 2045 will likely be twice their summer day peak.
That's huge. All right. So we've got one question here in response to an earlier point that Doug was making. In the jurisdiction, Doug, you were talking about earlier, did EV charging start as an evening peak and move to an overnight peak, or was it always an overnight peak? So in essence, did the daily time of the EV peak change over time as EV adoption increased?
Well, you couldn't see the peak early on because most people just plugged into a 15 amp outlet. As we saw level 2 chargers go in as the batteries got larger in EVs and the range got longer, then we started to see the peak happen, and we've seen it vacillate between 6:30 in the evening and 7:30 in the evening. And it tends to be a little bit earlier in the winter time and a little bit later in the summertime. So in almost every case, the sun has already set when we hit peak in that community.
Okay. All right, this is the final question from the audience. It says, we are all going to be chasing the same resources to meet mandated deadlines. And add into that a generational labor shortage, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which puts more pressure on resources. Is there any way to realistically meet these goals, A, at all, or B, at a cost that is manageable, recognizing they may not care, but do governments understand these pressures?
I don't think governments understand. I think the US government proved that when on the 28th of December in 2022, they released a notice of proposed rulemaking that froze investment in service transformers and distribution substation transformers. And even though they've had in hand all the rebuttals to that notice of proposed rulemaking, they are completely frozen on what they're going to do. And this notice of proposed rulemaking would have improved transformer efficiency by 0.03%. So I think that proves that mostly governments don't understand how complex this is. And we're now looking at 160 weeks for North American produced transformers for service use, 25 kVA, 30 kVA, 50 kVA, when the used to be an 18 to 30 week lead time. And we can't invest because if the notice is approved, every piece of equipment in every transformer manufacturing facility is junk. And it will be junk by 2027. Who's going to invest in millions of dollars of new transformer manufacturing equipment only to throw it away 4 years later?
That's a great point.
We're not going to make all of this happen on the timeline that people want unless we mobilize like North America mobilized in World War II, and we set aside almost everything else people do in order to put a large percentage of the workforce, whether they like it or not, consider the draft, to work on fixing the infrastructure.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Doug, for those in-depth answers. Appreciate that. Joanna, if you wouldn't mind sharing the Q&A slide, we have our panelists email information so that folks can reach out to them. Seems like there's a lot of interest and a lot of great knowledge that our panelists have today. So there you go. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Eric, Doug, or Joanna at those emails. Joanna, any final thoughts before we conclude today's session? Oh, just you're on mute there.
I just want to say thank you to Electricity Canada to hosting us and having us, to our esteemed audience. We're really, really appreciative of your valuable time. I'm very thankful to be working with such subject matter experts such as Doug and Eric. It's such a pleasure. We look forward to solving all your problems and electrifying all your needs because, again, we're all in the energy sector and we're all very passionate. So thank you so much to all of you and for everything that you do.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Eric. This was a really great and insightful session. So with that, we're going to conclude today's session. But before we let everybody go, just a reminder on our next webinar. It's on Thursday, November 9th. Utilitas will be presenting on Next Gen AMI, Unlocking the Possibilities. And just a reminder, all of our future events and webinars can be found in our newsletter and on our website at electricity.ca. With that, we'll let you go. Thank you very much again to Burns and McDonnell in 1898 for the session today and to our audience for joining us. We'll talk to you next time. Stay safe. Bye for now.
Take care, everybody. See ya.